Hey, so as the effects of climate change are becoming more and more present, um, I thought it'd be interesting to get into the neoliberal global capitalist response to the changing conditions of the earth as it burns. I wrote this paper for a class a couple months ago, but it's just gonna be more and more relevant from here on out. So I'm gonna read that and pretend that it's a scripted video. It's whiskey, but it's actually rum. Yeah, I am drinking a Monster energy drink at 9 p.m., but it's sugar free. Okay, let's do it. The Northwest Passage, or climate change profiteering. In late August 2007, the Northwest Passage became ice-free for the first time in recorded history. Ships could now traverse a northern route to get around North America without the assistance of an icebreaker, and using favorable conditions. Reliable access to the long sought-after trading route is additionally opening up new resources to exploit, including fishing and oil drilling. While the official route of the Northwest Passage was mapped out in the 19th century, commercial ships using the lane have been incredibly sparse due to pervasive sea ice. As summer ice at the poles begins receding further and further each year, traffic through the passage is starting to increase drastically, with tens of thousands of ships operating in the Arctic by 2014. This change is an example of climate change profiteering, something that it's probably a term out there in the lexicon, but for the purposes of this paper, I made it up. I'm not going to claim ownership over it, but it's something that I thought fit this phenomenon. So this change is an example of climate change profiteering, the response of a global neoliberal economic system to climate change by capitalizing off of rapidly changing socio-environmental conditions and creating markets that take advantage of newly accessible resources. In this video, it says paper, but video, fuck you. In this video, I will discuss the issue of climate profiteering viewed through the lens of social, environmental, and economic relationships to the changing landscape of the Arctic, in addition to other forms of this phenomenon. I will approach these ideas through the lenses, these are academic lenses that deal with like politicizing nature. So through the lenses of producing nature, globalizing nature, valuing nature, and governing nature. I am going to be sick of the word nature by the end of this. I'm doing all this in order to contextualize the forces behind climate profiteering and its social, environmental, and political ramifications. Let's do another shot. Let's do another shot. I am an alcoholic. Chase with water this time. Can you tell I'm from Philly? This isn't branding. I used to work for FedEx and I fucking hate them. Ugh. The Northwest Passage. That is the title of the video, but it's also the title of the section. So, shut up. Trade is an indispensable hallmark of societies, playing a defining role in geopolitics long before the oldest form of record-keeping. Transcontinental trade routes were present even in the Bronze Age as Mesopotamian Mediterranean empires grew powerful from the use of bronze, an alloy requiring tin, an element not found in meaningful quantities anywhere near these earliest empires, and thus requiring long-distance trade. The Silk Road carried luxury goods between Rome and China, and when the Roman Empire finally fell and interrupted this trade route, it led to the largest paradigm shift in human history and the largest shift in recent ecological history. The Eastern Roman Empire, referred to today as the Byzantine Empire, survived the Western provinces by a millennium. providing reliable access to goods from the Silk Road to Europe until Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Contentious relationships between the Christian kingdoms of Europe and higher tariffs on imports led to kingdoms attempting to find alternate routes to India and China to secure a monopoly on trade themselves, launching the era of colonialism. Portugal, in order to tap into the spice trade even before Constantinople fell, set up a series of trading posts that circled around the southern tip of Africa. After reconquering Iberia from the Moors, the Catholic monarchs of Spain funded a voyage to find a western route to Asia, one that would have proved certain death had there not been a continent in the way. Look, the entire world knew that the world was round, or Europe and Africa and Asia. The scholars there all knew that the world was round ever since the Greeks and the Macedonian Empire in Egypt. There's actually a really cool thing where this guy calculated the circumference of the Earth reasonably well about 2,000 years ago in Ptolemaic Egypt by looking at the shadows of two obelisks, like 200 miles from each other, one on the equator, one not. Really cool. Anyway, so Columbus was a fucking moron, and he thought that it was going to be a lot shorter to Asia. And if the Americas weren't in the way, dude's dead. Dude died. Dude got dead. Anyway. Once European explorers realized that they had uncovered a new land, Columbus never did, he's a moron, monarchies started to fund efforts to conquer and extract resources, ruthlessly adapting to profit off of the new environment. Colonial occupation resulted in a massive reduction in the indigenous population of the Americas, in addition to a change in ecological environments at an unprecedented scale in human history. The interchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the two land masses, known as the Columbian Exchange, had profound impacts on both Europe and the Americas. Through the centuries of resource extraction from the colonies, the dream of a more efficient trade route with East Asia was never forgotten. Only 5 years following the discovery of the Americas, King Henry VII funded an expedition to find a northwestern route to Asia. This marked the beginning of a 4-century search for such a trade route, involving explorers the likes of John Hudson, who searched to no avail. In 1850, an expedition intending to discover the fate of an earlier failed expedition mapped out the route now officially recognized as the Northwest Passage, proving that passage by sea was possible if incredibly difficult due to sea ice. The first transit of the passage solely by boat came 56 years later, and its use was still very, very sparse in the following decades. Though theoretical, it was not yet practical, and European empires began to implement other solutions to the problem of the trade route to Asia, including reshaping landscapes themselves. France constructed the Suez Canal, and the United States dug the Panama Canal, cutting off thousands of miles in shipping distances as vessels no longer needed to circumvent Africa or South America, respectively. The Northwest Passage fell out of the priorities of empires. The new canal routes were efficient enough to ramp up resource extraction and colonize more and more territories, the construction of the Suez Canal being instrumental in helping set off the scramble for Africa. When the geography of the newly discovered Americas proved inconvenient to European empires in facilitating the trade with Asia that they desired, they transformed the environment into one that was more amenable to their motives. Canals carved, railroads built, the shape of the land itself was restructured to be more profitable. In an outcome that is laden with irony, the structures of power and capital that intentionally changed the landscapes of Panama and Egypt to compensate for the lack of a feasible Northwest Passage are the same structures that are responsible for the indirect drastic change to the environment of the Arctic that rendered the Northwest Passage eventually viable. Capitalism is, causing climate change, so, a little... Ecological conquest and the transforming of landscapes to suit the needs of complex societies have been around as long as agriculture has, but the large-scale effects that are changing global biomes with increasing frequency are far more recent. Capitalism emerged out of mercantilism and colonialism, a fusion between trade and exploitation that continued the hoarding of wealth by the elite class. Neoliberal capitalism, proliferating in the 80s as a return to the more laissez-faire model of Adam Smith, places the sole metric of value to the financial value of a thing, always seeking to improve profit above all else. Literally, companies, the only obligation that they have is to make profits for their shareholders. They're not held to anything else. This neoliberal model of capitalism that's been around since Reagan and Thatcher, that really started it. Uh, this has resulted in climate profiteers who are profiting from the acceleration of environmental destruction. The flexibility of neoliberalism in exploiting new markets has created a diverse array of these profiteers with different approaches. With more and more ships traversing the Northwest Passage every year, more infrastructure is added commensurately to sustain this global shift in trade. This infrastructure also supporting the increase in resource extraction, such as fishing, oil drilling, and tourism, they all became more easily accessible. This is not limited to solely the Canadian Arctic, as melting sea ice has also made transportation easier in the Russian Arctic, a northeast passage. What had once been generally inaccessible is now open to a fresh wave of exploitation. The use of an environment that is being catastrophically transformed by capitalist exploitation to then further the process responsible for this destabilization is, on the surface, baffling, and, depending on one's morals, reprehensible. However, from the lens of the value system of neoliberalism, the choice to exploit newly available resources is an obvious one. Complicating the issue of increased Arctic shipping, while the shipping industry does account for a significant portion of greenhouse gas emission, the shorter route through the Arctic mildly offsets those emissions. Climate profiteering may present itself as positive or necessary, using the new social, economic, or environmental conditions to its advantage, though for all the surface-level positives that may result, the underlying problem remains. For example, electric vehicles are marketed to people convinced that they will help stop the climate change, while the electricity used to charge these cars is still predominantly produced by burning fossil fuels. The metals needed for the batteries are often mined in the global south as well, affecting those environments and vastly underpaying laborers, as well as child laborers, or as you might call it, child slavery, along with other exploitative practices. This also still affirms American car culture and decreases emphasis on other transportation solutions such as public transit. So all in all, bad system, bad idea, guys. Let's fucking do other things. Carbon taxes, designed to incentivize burning fewer fossil fuels. Say that a couple times fast. Carbon taxes designed to incentivize burning fewer fossil fuels also lead to the generation of profit by allowing countries to pay for how much they pollute, meaning a sufficiently rich country can simply ignore decarbonization targets. Lastly, an example which will have a profound effect on a vast number of people in the future is water. Increased droughts as a result of climate change will accelerate the scarcity of fresh water already felt in some places in the world, and increasing scarcity, maybe shots were a bad idea. An increasing scarcity will result in prices soaring, rendering a human necessity as a luxury commodity. I should have edited this paper more. Tenses don't agree. Water's already been commodified, as is the case with bottled water companies taking water rights away from surrounding communities, and as of 2021, water futures are already being sold on the stock market to investors. It's a great system. There is no way that this is... Okay. Take another shot, take another shot, take another shot with me. Take another shot, take another shot, take another shot with me. Oh shit, that's big. Oh no. Oh god, oh fuck. Oh, this is gonna be bad. Ah. Nicotine. Okay. Lens 1. Valuing nature. How individuals and societies value nature is deeply embedded in climate profiteering. In its most evidently destructive form, climate profiteering solely values nature as commodity. However, other forms prey on consumers who value the environment as something to be protected and conserved. Anthropocentric ideas about nature have proved to be pervasive throughout history. Philosophies and faiths gave justification for the idea that humans are separate from nature, superior, and with the moral obligation to dominate it and render it useful to humans. This anthropocentrism bestowed. I keep saying bestowed. Ugh, shots were a bad idea. This anthropocentrism bestowed intrinsic value only to humans. Anything else only had value in relation to use by humans. This hierarchy that situated humans on top instills a sense of self-centered moral justification for environmental degradation. This in turn created other hierarchies that justified in othering and oppressing other groups. Perhaps not created, but are symbiotic with. It's the part of our brain that wants to go like, I'm on top, I'm the top man, Mr. Top Man. The idea of anthropocentrism is more and more challenged as the externalities of human activities are disrupting environments in more obvious and deleterious ways, yet it remains the operating philosophy of the systems of power that are responsible for these externalities. Industries that are responsible for accelerating the damage are the ones that will lose profits if decisive global action were taken, and therefore fund propaganda and politicians to secure their future. Look at how many politicians and private think tanks the Koch brothers have funded. You will lose your goddamn mind. Am I the only person who remembers the Panama Papers? This denial that humans could cause cataclysmic changes to Earth systems is an interesting denial of anthropocentrism. They are essentially stating that there is no possible way that humans could dominate nature to the degree that would render the Earth uninhabitable for humans. Digging deeper leads to the realization that there is no moral center other than profit. If that is a moral, is profit a moral? Well, the jury's out on that. These systems can deny climate change one day and admit its reality the next, as is the case with political and corporate entities discussing new opportunities in the Arctic resulting from the melting sea ice while still publicly denying the situation. The dominant political and economic dogma stemming from anthropocentrism and resultant exploitation has accelerated in the last century. As Mary Evelyn Tucker states in the short film A Thousand Suns, in our modern world we have become gods controlling nature. And that's in large measure because in 1 century we've gone from 2 billion to 6 billion people. We've become this huge presence on the planet. So, all of a sudden, we do perceive ourselves as invincible. We can do anything. And that's where technology without limits has pushed us to this precipice of almost self-destruction, because we have viewed nature as simply something to be used for humans, for economic growth and power. The narrative of anthropocentrism lost some of its luster in the 20th century. A series of man-made environmental disasters occurred in the century as a result of negligence, with the effects of synthetic compounds accumulating in local environments, such as incidents like Love Canal or Times Beach. These saw synthetic toxins carelessly introduced to the environment, disastrously affecting nearby residents and wildlife. Events such as these led to the environmental justice movement, and eventually the establishment of the EPA. Nixon established the EPA. That blows my mind. I don't know. Nixon better than all Republicans who have come after him, maybe? Nah, he's just as much as a war criminal as the rest of them. Yeah, he's better. He's better. Fuck Reagan. This represents a mild shift away from anthropocentrism. Laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act represented the acknowledgement that environmental health was a public health issue. In abstract terms, this recognized that humans were part of the environment and depended on it, marking a mild step towards proper stewardship being codified into law. This perception still relates the value of the environment to human values, but it better reflects a way of representing nature as a human environment, not separate and untamed, but landscapes that humans interact with and play an ecological role in. The Arctic is often represented as a desolate, uninhabitable place, with abstract value to many because of the biome's effect on global climate, but with no value for settlement. However, there are many indigenous groups that inhabit these regions, people who hold different values as to the worth of this environment than the nations that claim these territories and exploit them. Dozens of culturally and linguistically distinct groups inhabit the Arctic landscape around the Arctic Circle, yet the entire geopolitical region is controlled by only 5 countries. Fishing and drilling for oil provide financial and political value to the nations that own and exploit them, but it does so at the cost of the indigenous groups residing there that value the landscape as a home. And this disrupts local ecology in ways that, reduce their quality of life. The valuation of nature as something to be conserved and something that is intrinsically valuable to all life on the planet is a point of view that is growing ever more prevalent as the impacts of climate change become more and more immediate and obvious. However, this valuation of nature also plays a role in climate profiteering, as misleading or overstated advertisements that market environmentally friendly products towards people with genuine concern over climate change. This is more outwardly malicious in a trend that's known as greenwashing, a marketing ploy that gives the impression that a product or service is environmentally friendly. They can just lie. They can just say that. They don't have to be. They just say it. Similarly, many pro-business lobbying groups have misleading names that sound pro-environment, such as the Global Climate Coalition, in order to shape environmental policy to their benefit. It's fucked. We're fucked, guys. There's no hope. I am a drunk. Ooh, that's a big one. God, I'm so bored. This is cheap shit. That should work. Yes, I know chasing with an energy drink is really bad for your heart, but I've done worse. And also there's, no hope for life beyond my 40th birthday. Anyway. Lens 2. 2. Globalizing nature. Trade continues to play as defining a role in modern civilization as it did in antiquity, if not more so. I'd argue more so. Trade gave rise to European powers carrying out colonialism and resource extraction on a massive scale, drastically altering the social and environmental ecology of the Americas. Globalized trade arose from globe-spanning empires, even as the colonial version of trade was generally one-sided and inherently exploitative. With the advent of railroads and the digging of the Panama and Suez Canals, trade became more efficient, and this globalized system permitted a world where most products in developed countries contained components sourced from several other countries in the global south and likely assembled in several more, occurring on such a large scale that individual products become relatively cheap. Or, rather, the externalities of such a process are offloaded onto other parts of the system, from exploited environments to underpaid workers to pollution in the global south. So even though it seems cheap to us in, developed nations, all of the negative externalities, what makes it expensive, is being pushed off onto other parts of the system. This system has an inherent fragility to it, a recent example exposing such fragility being the Evergreen ship running aground in the Suez Canal, disrupting the global trade and costing billions of dollars, and it was fucking rad. This fragility incentivizes more efficient exploitation and transportation of capital. As a result, the newfound ice-free status of the Northwest Passage was immediately recognized for its potential in global trade. Taking advantage of this route was a natural response of actors in the global economy, the action less malicious than it was practical given the dependence of modern life in developed nations on globalized trade. This, however, does come across as cynical, taking advantage of anthropogenic environmental destabilization in order to further perpetuate the systems of power and profit responsible for it. The Arctic has become one of the individual biomes used to represent the concept of climate change as a whole to the general populace. Climate change is unfathomably complex and all-encompassing, and communicating its scale and scope is challenging, so individual examples are often used to imply the problem exists on a global scale. The Arctic, as well as the Antarctic, are effective at communicating these ideas due to the worldwide implications of climate change in these regions would cause, and assist in communicating the idea of a global nature. The Amazon rainforest is one of the most widely discussed examples of human deforestation, serving as a discrete example of a worldwide process of deforestation. The Amazon can be seen from space, and likewise its deforestation over the years is also visible from that scale. In a similar vein, the melting of the polar ice caps was an effective and visually striking representation of a warmer climate. Polar ice is also visible from space, and is the most directly visible effect of anthropogenic domination at planetary scales apart from light pollution. The sense of scale invokes the severity of the problem, and its scope helps to conceptualize the idea of one global nature, one large, complex system that humans have destabilized drastically. Sea level rise associated with this melting also connects the melting of the Arctic ice to consequences that for many are more localized. The possible global ramifications including drowned cities and the displacement of people on unprecedented scales. The Arctic is an effective communicator because its impacts are so apparent and so global. However, this is still an abstraction, something incredibly distant from most population centers, and the predicted consequences are in the future and incomprehensibly destructive, which can lead to a disassociation or disconnection for many people. The reason for the efficacy of the narrative of melting ice caps is also the reason for its inefficiency. It is not readily apparent, and it is not local. It is difficult to conceptualize how large the Earth is and the intricacy of the systems that dominate day-to-day life. It is the same disassociation that results in many people never considering where most of their possessions are sourced from, or even made. Global capitalism alienates people from nature, inserting so many layers of separation between people and their possessions and their food that many people are entirely oblivious to how they interact with the global environment. Climate change is similarly global and an incredibly complex interaction of different systems interacting, and it can be equally alienating. Human activity has drastically impacted worldwide climate and ecology to such a degree that all landscapes are now dominated by this influence, and the scale of this interaction is alarming and further alienates people from nature. The alienation of people from the production of their food and goods has provided circumstances for climate profiteers to thrive. Greenwashing was so effective because global production is so immensely complicated that most consumers have no baseline for how their products are made, no concept of processes necessary at a production level to achieve sustainability, and little incentive to investigate the legitimacy of a product. Green capitalism, bearing similar traits to climate profiteering, seeks to profit from the anxieties of their consumers by promising more environmentally friendly goods while entirely ignoring the root cause. Electric cars, which I've already bitched about, after appearing briefly in the 90s and then disappearing in no small part due to the efforts of the oil industry, are currently undergoing a resurgence as part of a trend that blames consumers for climate change and convinces them to buy into these new markets. They're still consumers. Ignoring the fact that most energy production still uses fossil fuels, globalization maintains the structure of the neoliberal free market and buries the externalities, distancing the consumer from the consequences of such a market while profiting off of environmental anxieties. Many environmentally friendly products are produced by companies who would rather not solve environmental problems. If the world were saved, their marketing would be less effective, and they would make less money. You guessed it, it's a new section. It's a new shot. I am going through this. That's bad. I do not have the money to sustain this alcoholism. Alcoholism. I don't know why I'm whispering. Am I doing ASMR now? Fuck you. Alright, it's water. We're doing water. It's empty. It doesn't look like water, but it is. It just has some raspberry lemonade flavoring in it. Off-brand. Because I'm poor. Okay. Lens 3. Governing nature. 5 nations control the northernmost coastline on Earth, straddling the Arctic Circle, giving these nations control over the geopolitical region and its resources. Each of these 5 nations are controlled by people not indigenous to the areas that they have sovereignty over, all remnants of conquest or colonialism. These 5 nations, Canada, the United States, the Russian Federation, the Kingdom of Norway, and the Kingdom of Denmark, are populated by less than 7% of the world's population, yet together they collectively govern the entirety of a biome that influences climate cycles worldwide. Greenland and Nunavut are regions given some level of autonomy from Denmark and Canada respectively, with indigenous people constituting the local government. So, little exception. Only a little one. Little teeny. Anyway. The Arctic was an area of varying geopolitical importance over the last century, the region providing more strategic than economic benefits. During the Cold War, Arctic territory was useful for military surveillance and testing, and interestingly, Anchorage, Alaska became one of the most important airports in the world, providing the shortest route between NATO-affiliated countries over the North Pole due to restrictions on Soviet airspace. Only recently, with the opening of the Northwest Passage, and newly available economic interests in the region, has the region experienced a surge of geopolitical interest and activity. Maritime borders in the Arctic were stagnant and standard for such borders. However, the recent interest has resulted in countries submitting claims to the UN to obtain more oceanic territory, geologically surveying continental shelves to legitimize their claim, using science in order to, get a land grab for more resources. Geology became a political tool in order for competing countries to claim as much available territory as possible. As soon as governments realized that they could soon access oil and gas reserves in the region, natural land formations were rendered as a weapon for resource competition. Russia, Denmark, via Greenland, and Canada all have overlapping claims in the Arctic Ocean. These climate profiteers recognize the changing ecological landscape and rush to stake economic claims in the area. The irony of extracting fossil fuels from the Arctic as a result of sea ice melting because of climate change, obvious to many environmental groups, but entirely inconsequential to the geopolitical battleground. This conflict between economic interests of developed nations and the moral obligation to combat climate change has resulted in predictably limp results resulting from the constantly shifting nature of socio-political systems. Long-term sustainability goals are hollow, insincere promises, as individual nations prioritize short-term economic goals. Another layer of irony in the maze of competing social and political factors relates back to the global economy. The world is so intricately interconnected in trade within a global system of commerce, this powerful and pervasive, yet worldwide governments seem unable to cooperate in the face of this existential threat. Slavoj Žižek is credited with saying, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism." He's not the only one credited with that. In Capitalist Realism, there's 2 credits to it, but Žižek is the most well-known one. And the general response of world powers seems to reaffirm this sentiment. The first approach is international agreements to meet certain environmental targets, agreements that are voluntary and unenforced. The United States abstained from signing the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, leading to its failure, and left the Paris Climate Accords for several years. The largest emitter of greenhouse gases per capita, the violent flipping of the United States government between mildly concerned about climate change and actively accelerating environmental destruction through different administrations leaves this country woefully unable to commit to any long-term economic or environmental targets. The other predominant method that the world leaders try in order to attempt to mitigate climate change is simply hoping that market solutions will work. This belief that profit incentive will motivate industries towards sustainable practices reinforces greenwashing, without actually spending the capital needed to actually do so. Hoping that the market will sort itself out and fix arising problems is a continuation of the proto-deity that Adam Smith came up with to explain why this laissez-faire capitalism would end up being fair. The invisible hand of the market. It's just another god. While governments have the actual political and economic power to effect change, it is easier for them to appeal to these invisible forces, refusing to acknowledge the role of capitalism in the issue, and continue to profit from environmental exploitation. What makes this trend baffling is the effectiveness in which world governments are able to comprehensively ban the manufacturing and use of CFCs once they were linked to the hole in the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol was a coalition of governments agreeing upon and implementing procedures that prevented an immediate environmental calamity, and it worked. In the case of climate change, the problem is more overtly systemic, but the similarities are there. Like, they solved the ozone issue, at least until recently. Now there's off-brand CFCs that are circulating around black markets that are causing more and more eating away of the oceans because of the free radical chlorine or fluorine, one of those two, or like, breaking apart ozone molecules up in the troposphere. But it's cool. It's all good. It's all good. Nothing to worry about. We're not all dying of cancer more because of all the shit that we've done to the environment. Here's a hint. We are. It's time for another lens, and it's time for another shot. I don't know why I wanna sing about every time I get more drunk, because it makes me feel better that I have alcohol issues. There is no rhyme scheme, there is no melodic thing to what I'm saying. Ooh, violent reaction to that one. Maybe my body is telling me, don't do the thing you're doing, but I'm going to. Anyway, lens, what is this, 4? Yeah. Lens 4, producing nature. Humans have been reshaping global ecology for as long as humans have been around. However, the recent acceleration in anthropogenic effects on the global systems is significant enough to the history of the Earth that a new geological age has come as a result, the anthropocene, which is a concept that is widely accepted. Anthropogenic effects have changed ecological and climatological conditions so noticeably that it will be readily apparent when studying the geological history of the Earth. Imagine a couple million years from now, if another intelligent species arises on this planet, they dig down, there's a layer of plastic. Like, we are, and also like ice cores, if there's still ice, will show that the carbon levels in the atmosphere have risen drastically during this time period. So, like, we are imprinting our history on this earth. While the term is debated in terms of accuracy, political relevance, and to the date as to which the Anthropocene began, the concept itself as a human-defined era is accepted among researchers. It took a lot to fucking say that. When modern humans migrated out of Africa, every continent they spread to experienced an extinction of endemic megafauna, a result considered to have been caused by a mixture of overhunting and the inability of local megafauna to react to them, possessing no evolutionary defense against or fear of humans in landscapes outside of Africa. The migration of humans to all corners of the globe brought with it noticeable changes to the ecology of each location that was settled. The discovery of agriculture and the development of animal domestication saw humans selectively breeding plants and animals, steadily altering genomes until they were as beneficial to human civilizations as possible. The Columbian Exchange mildly homogenized global ecology and severely reshaped the cultures and ecologies of Eurasia and the Americas. I should say Afro-Eurasia, because that's all one big thing. All of these events occurred centuries to millennia before one of the traditionally considered inceptions of the Anthropocene, the Industrial Revolution. I don't know why I keep putting everything in quotes. And a case could be made for any one of them. What is important to take away from these examples is the relationship between humans and nature, in that nature is heavily produced as a result of human interaction, and what many would consider pristine or natural landscapes are in fact shaped by human forces. As human evolution was shaped and defined by environmental conditions and pressures, humans have in turn shaped and defined the environment of wherever they occupied. From this lens, anthropocentrism fails to understand the reciprocal relationship between the humans and the environment. As a species, humans were traditionally bound to specific places and intimately familiar with their relationship to the environment. Every environment that humans have produced is still nature, even if inherently frail and unsustainable when abandoned in environments such as agricultural monocultures. Nature that has been reworked and recontextualized into human ecosystems. National parks and protected environments are likewise very cultivated environments, tailored to aesthetic or scientific or cultural desires. This conception of untamed wilderness, a true natural world unaffected by humans, is a conception that redefined indigenous lands that were very much human environments into something more ephemeral, a hegemonic ideal of what nature should be as opposed to what it is. This carries into conservation efforts, the stated goal of many being to restore environments to some sort of baseline, usually imagined as how they were before human influence. However, as is the case with cumulative anthropogenic interaction with landscapes and ecologies, the concept of untouched by humans is a baseline that is both impossible to conceptualize as well as not particularly relevant. Even in restoring environments, the process is still an act of producing nature. The Northwest Passage was a human socio-political concept long before it was ever a physically viable option. Economic and cultural forces such as trade routes continually define understandings of the natural world. The production of nature within the context of climate profiteering is following the same dynamic as all other production of nature. Humans redefine environments to access resources, or for strategic or cultural reasons. This recontextualization of the Arctic is a natural continuation of identifying and extracting resources. However, the context in which it is happening is interesting. Rather than humans directly reshaping natural environments, they are taking advantage of large-scale externalities from modern industry and energy production that is producing nature as a result of human influence, but doing so in large, drastic, and unmediated ways. The Anthropocene is an age in Earth's history when stability is entirely discarded, and whatever was considered average or baseline in the past is continually changing. The new normal is the lack of normality. Anthropogenic influences are inadvertently producing nature on a global scale, and it is where rapidly changing Earth conditions interact with neoliberal markets that reveals a unique interaction between two different forms of producing nature. Greenhouse gas emissions trap solar energy, steadily adding heat to the atmosphere. Rising temperatures melt more sea ice in the summer, exposing more profitable trade routes, and bearing the promise of an economically feasible oil drilling in the Arctic. Humans reshape this newly profitable region in order to further exploit it more efficiently. This new market doubles down on fossil fuel energy production, contributing further to climate change, which compounds the original conditions and possibly exposes even more oil reserves. This can be an example of an environmental feedback loop, specifically a positive feedback loop, in which the effects of an action contribute more to the action becoming more and more prevalent. The most prevalent example, or the most easy to communicate example, is the ice albedo effect. So ice is white, and white surfaces reflect solar energy back into space, as opposed to black surfaces which absorb them. So the more white surfaces and more ice are on the Earth, the more solar energy is reflected back into space. However, as more and more ice melts, the less energy is reflected and more energy is trapped in the Earth, and the more the ice melts and it feeds back, it keeps going. That's the opposite of a negative feedback loop, where the results of an action stop it from happening any further. Just so we're clear. Rising temperatures melt more sea ice in the summer, exposing more profitable trade routes and bearing the promise of economically feasible oil drilling in the Arctic. Humans reshape this newly profitable region to further exploit it more efficiently. This new market doubles down on fossil fuel energy production, further contributing to climate change, which compounds the original conditions and possibly exposes even more oil reserves. This can be an example of an environmental feedback loop, however, an incredibly unique one because the exploitative economic systems are deliberately fanning the flames on both sides. Producing nature can include vastly different processes, from conserving a forest to the wholesale destabilization of the Earth's climate. So, it's a better frame for understanding the complexity of human-environment interactions than it is for making value-laden judgments. Alright, it's the conclusion section, so last shot. Not last shot for the night, 'cause I have issues, but it's the last shot for this video. Hopefully I'm not too drunk to read. The pines were roaring on the heights. Yes, I know I'm off key. Shut the fuck up. The winds were mourning. In the night, the fire was red. Okay, I'm done with that. Ugh, I'm sitting down. Not good for the diaphragm. Not good for singing. I was never good at singing. Let's go. Okay. Conclusion. The scramble for resources in the Arctic as a result of a rapidly changing world is a fascinating microcosm of the response of current economic and political systems to climate change. This competition to exploit newly available resources is a trend in the global north, with traditionally wealthy countries finding ways to continually seek monetary gain. In the neoliberal economic system designed to benefit developed nations, the catastrophic effects of climate change seem further away than they do to developing nations with no such security blanket of wealth. While European powers are snatching up the Arctic in anticipation of future oil drilling, also, United States and Canada, other countries more directly at risk from climate change in the global south are planning beyond the profit motive and attempting to mitigate some of the more devastating impacts. African nations with territory in the Sahel region, bordering the Sahara, the south of the Sahara. So the Sahel is like the savanna between the Sahara and like the more tropical climate regions. African nations with territory in the Sahel region bordering the Sahara have been working collectively to reforest part of the region, creating a Great Green Wall to prevent desertification and sustain further population growth. Developing nations in the global south continue to experience systemic issues originating from their colonial occupation. Following decolonization, if, decolonization was ever considered as complete or a success, which, it wasn't. Following decolonization, economies based on resource extraction still pervaded as economic aid packages to the global south were leveraged in order to secure these resources inexpensively. The supply of lithium and cobalt to developed countries are necessary for electric vehicle batteries. However, the mines where they are obtained are often unregulated, with hazardous working conditions, and also employ child labor. Slavery! Similar practices obtain rare metals used in smartphones, which are now designed to rapidly become obsolete. Market practices of developed nations are incredibly wasteful in order to ensure consistent revenue streams, doing so at the expense of developing nations who bear the environmental and social burden of such practices. The United States began outsourcing much of its manufacturing to countries with far fewer labor rights, both accelerating the globalization of neoliberal markets, as well as saving money through highly exploitative labor practices that they could no longer continue at home. The balance of power in this globalized economy is still regulated solely by a handful of actors. While the direct brutality of colonial occupation was gone, the economic, social, and environmental consequences linger. Greenhouse gas emissions are sourced in majority from developed nations, and the emission per capita of these regions is even more drastically one-sided, representing the extreme disparity in global power and agency between developed nations and the global south. While the most influential structures of power and capital in the world are wreaking havoc on the earth, the ramifications are felt by developing countries. Developed nations emit greenhouse gases at rates that dwarf all other nations proportionally to their population, and developing nations are the first to witness the calamity of climate change. As climate change begins to dramatically redefine global systems and biomes, developed nations search for ways to profit off of these changes, furthering the cycle. Climate profiteers are an inevitable consequence of the neoliberal tendency to value nature solely in monetary terms, profiting from exploitative business tactics and taking advantage of globalized infrastructure that caters to the wealthiest of nations. And the fact that political leaders often share the same interests as well as create and maintain a system that allows for such disturbing manipulation of environmental and economic systems that seems to be accelerating as climate change worsens. There is a counterpoint to this seemingly self-destructive trend, the self-fulfilling prophecy of capitalist exploitation, and it happens to be a perfect mirror to what the Arctic is currently experiencing. A case study where diplomacy and the pursuit of science in an invaluable biome at the end of the world are primary objectives. This is the story of Antarctica. Though the idea of a southern continent was persistent in culture dating back centuries, Antarctica was not properly discovered until the 19th century, a parallel to the story of the Northwest Passage. Antarctica was subject to the same onslaught of land claims as other continents colonized by European powers. However, hostile conditions prevented settlement and early exploitation. In recognition of the scientific value of Antarctica, and in light of the proliferation of nuclear testing and the geopolitical complexity of the Cold War, the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. The United States and the Soviet Union spearheaded this agreement, banning military uses of the continent, setting it aside purely for science and international cooperation. Though some countries still claim territory in this region, these claims are not universally recognized, and no new claims have been permitted following the treaty. Antarctica is a continent inhabited entirely by researchers, the population dwindling down to merely 1,000 during the winter, operating under very strict environmental regulations to preserve the continent. This kind of international cooperation and commitment towards peaceful and scientific actions taking place on the continent is incredibly out of the norm for most modern systems of power. Promoting a similar friendly competition and eventual collaboration as the space race did, this treaty is one of the few, very few, inspiring actions of humanity that came out of the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war was terrifying enough to prevent its outbreak, and the trend of competition in the pursuit of science in its stead was emblematic of a more collaborative and idealistic future. Antarctica stands out as that last refuge of idealism. There is a sadistic irony in that the only continent entirely devoid of permanent human settlement was the only one afforded complete protection from exploitation and environmental degradation. However, the continuation of Antarctica as a research station at the end of the world is a fascinating case study in opposition to the current geopolitical situation of the Arctic. Thank you. Alright, yeah, no, that's done. So, yeah, Antarctica is fucking cool, and the fact that people just go there only to do science is fucking cool. And I know that there's going to be drilling in the Antarctic in the next couple decades, but I have no hope left for the future, so it's cool. And I will include all of the work cited in the... what's it called? The description? Yeah, the description. It'll be in APA format, but it'll have links. Not all these articles are easy to find if you don't have access to some research databases, but if you're crafty, like me, you can find it. I haven't paid for a textbook in years. Okay, bye. The Silk Route, Silk Route, fuck you. I'm gonna say fuck you a lot, I should edit that out. The Silk... Trade continues to play a okay. Maybe drinking was a bad idea. Drastically altering... Why do I want to say alternator? Drastically altering the social and environmental ecology. Okay, drinking was a bad idea. Delicious. These climate profiteers recognize that the changing ecological landscape and rush... Okay. These climate profiteers recognize the changing ecological landscape and rush to stake economic claims in the area. I know I'm saying economic and economic, but my brain just fucking does whatever, so don't mention it. I should drink less. Market forces can outwardly appear as though they are mitigating environmental degradation without actually spending the capital. Without actually spending the capital. I can't say capital. Hoping that the market will sort itself out and fix arising problems is a continuation of the proto-deity. I don't know why I put that in quotes. I'm calling it a proto-deity. Adam Smith called it a deity. Anyway. While governments have the actual political and economic power to effect change... I used the wrong term of effect in this paper. Okay. While the term is debated in terms of... the concept itself as a human-defined era is accepted among researchers. researchers. The concept itself of a human-defined area is